Hello and welcome to the first event of the semester for the MarcDavid LGBTQ Center at Community College of Philadelphia. Today we are starting off our LGBTQ Discussion Series with Identities Beyond the Binary. And so we'll be talking about genders and sexualities that fall outside of binary understandings of gender and sexuality. So I'm excited to invite on our panelists and get this conversation started. So first, I'm going to bring on Samantha Maria, who is the owner of SayTen Studios, a local photographer and performer, as well as LGBTQ educator. And they'll be joining us today, as well as two faculty members, Amy Birge-Caracappa, who is in charge of curriculum development at the college, and En Davis, who is another professor at CCP and is also an LGBTQ educator. So we have a fantastic panel, and I'm just gonna jump right in and get started. So the first thing I'm gonna start with is introductions. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and share what identities you hold that fall outside of binary ideas of gender and sexuality?
Would you like me to start?
Sure, let's start with you.
So hi folks, my name is Samantha Maria Photos. You can call me Sam. I also go by the stage name Samantha SayTen. That's also viable. I use they and she pronouns. They're interchangeable, but I always put the they in front of the she because not that it's more affirming, but there's something that I resonate with in terms of like my non-binary identity, more so than my femme identity. Do you want to know about like, we're going to talk about sexuality and stuff, so I can give a little bit of that.
Yeah.
Sure. So I practice solo polyamory, which means that I engage in ethical non-monogamy. But I don't really welcome any contracts within the relationship. I feel I'm more important than the partners that I hold. And I don't necessarily I won't bend over backwards for things like love and intimacy, although I love love. It's wonderful. It's not something that I'm putting a lot of effort into. Currently have two partners. They're lovely, and a plethora of close friends. I'm pansexual. That's a thing. Mostly T for T, which means for the folks, it means I typically seek out other trans folks like myself, masc or femme. I love both energies. I think that's enough.
Thanks, Samantha. We'll go to Amy next.
Hi. So I what was I going to say? So I I identify as bisexual. I also identify as pansexual. I often will use the word queer to describe myself. I'm cis. My pronouns are she, her. I also wanted to mention though, like along with identifying that non-binary sense as being bisexual, pansexual, or queer, which ages me, I think, in a particular way. I also identify as fat, and identifying as fat really flies into like it really contradicts a lot of gender norms and gender roles, and that's been part of my life. That's been part of my life for so long that sometimes I forget how much that's connected.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Amy. And then En, why don't you introduce yourself as well?
Hello. I fall outside the binary, and I think the same ways that Sam and also Amy do. I'm gender non-binary, and so and that's like a very sort of like firm place for me. I sought out like that term, that sort of like category, that identity before like non-binary as a word, and also as a sort of like theoretical concept even existed. And so that's something that I feel really like the most falls most outside the non-binary. But if you ask me 15 years ago, 10 years ago, like, et cetera, when I didn't have a name for non-binary, I would have said bisexuality. I identify as pansexual now because I think that bisexuality can itself fall within the binary if it divides, like if it excludes non-binary people, if it excludes trans people. But that's, I think, the thing that growing up for a long time was the longest thing that fell outside the binary was my sexuality.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I definitely relate with that too. Like if you had asked me a few years ago, I probably would have told you I was a gay man, which is kind of funny because I had a very binary way of viewing things. Because even though I had been friends with trans people since I was 19 years old, most of the trans people in my life were binary trans people. So I didn't even realize that being non-binary was an option. So I didn't actually come out until I was in my 30s. As non-binary. And then after coming out as non-binary is when I started referring to myself as queer instead of gay, because my understanding of gender and who I was attracted to changed as my understanding of gender changed. So it is kind of interesting how a lot of non-binary people have experienced a lot of change throughout their identities over the years, especially because there's been this lack of visibility. So thank you all for sharing your little intros there, but let's just dive right into our first question. We're talking about binaries today. So what is the first time you really realized that you did not fit within a socially established binary? Whoever wants to answer first.
I can answer that first. For me, it was in school. I think like a lot of queer people, and queer is another, term that I identify with. That's the first term that I actually kind of owned because it didn't have as much stigma around it, and people started to use it in this sort of like political way in the 90s that I sort of identified with, not sort of like that I explicitly identified with. But the way I first sort of like recognized that was like other people telling me with the pejorative sense, like, like 8th grade, gym class, teacher's not around, they throw you like a ball and then they say run, and then they run after you and tackle you, and it's called smear the queer. And that's what, that was a sort of like game where I was sort of like the queer. And it was like, well, yeah, if I look at like my clothes and my mannerisms, etc., like other people can kind of tell, but I didn't really know that, like that I didn't fall within the binary. And so it was at school.
Yeah. I'll jump in just because the way I grew up, like I have to sort of understand I understand my own sexuality, like within this context of growing up in the 1970s in the middle of the United States with a mother who is a second wave feminist lesbian. So for me, from really, from the very beginning, gender and gender expression was always something that was on the table, talked about, even if we didn't have like the same vocabulary that we have today. I remember as a little kid, like listening to Free to Be You and Me like 1,000 times. And it starts like introduces those concepts, but also just the people we knew and the things that we did. So I knew lots and lots of, I was a little kid who knew lots of same-sex couples, and I knew, and I knew people who I now would identify as non-binary and trans, even though I didn't have a language for that when I was a kid.
Neither did they, likely, honestly.
Yeah. And then, like I said, I identify as bisexual, but I also understand how that can be, sort of recapitulating the binary. And so, I think I'm more often thinking of myself as pansexual these days. But for me, like queer was, as En said, so like queer is a way of saying not that thing. So I know I'm not that thing, right? But then there wasn't quite a language to figure out what I was. And I was in a particularly odd position because I knew so many same-sex couples. And it was sort of like, but I'm not really that, because I had, these clear attractions to other sort of female folks and but I also like really, really resisted the gender roles that seemed to be expected of me. And I found that kind of like super traditional, hetero way of dealing with each other to be really traumatic. Like, it was traumatizing. It was such a denial of who I was, and this was when I was a teenager. This was in Texas. So I not only was I supposed to be this tiny blonde girl, but which I have pictures. I tried, but I was also supposed to sort of relate to the men in my life in this particular way that just absolutely wasn't me and didn't fit me.
So for me, I can't answer this question without navigating my history of sexual trauma. So I do want to do a trigger warning. Hey, y'all. For me personally, I had engaged in sexual experiences at a very young age. So I kind of had to grow up really quickly, and I had to unpack gender as early as like pre-K and kindergarten. At the time and continuing on, I was really, really acute to the ways I was looked at and regarded when I behaved like a boy versus a girl, and I was always given boy. I was assigned boy, but I played with it a little bit, but I was super, super curious about the other femininity. And for me in my household, femininity had such a low and weak regard to it that it was something that I didn't feel I had access to. It wasn't accessible to me, or if it was accessible, it came with repercussions. So I felt seen mostly behind closed doors, and unfortunately, it's kind of relied on boys and like men who engaged with me to help me kind of figure out what it was that I wanted to be. And it took me years and years and years and years. And that I found out later on, it didn't really help it. It drastically hurt me. And I'm still like living with that trauma and healing from that trauma. And the fact that it's wrapped up with my gender identity, I oftentimes feel that trauma emerging when I'm unpacking my own gender. So it's understanding gender for me is part of my healing. That's what I'll say for now. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually really relate with that. Like the having like your trans identity tied up in other kind of things and other traumas and stuff, because and Amy, you kind of mentioned this, like identifying as a fat person. I feel like a lot of my fat dysmorphia and my gender dysphoria are like interlinked, because a lot of times like was like, is this an issue with my body because it's so masculine, or is it an issue with my body because of the expectations around thinness and around fat bodies in this country? And so like it's kind of interesting how all of these different identities and different experiences can interlink and inform each other, and also kind of be intertwined with each other, because there's times where I literally cannot tell you if that is like gender dysphoria or fat dysmorphia. Like it's indistinguishable, because I would think like when I was younger, like, oh yeah, it's so hard to find clothes for fat men. If I was a fat woman, at least I could have all these cute clothes, that whatever. But to me, that didn't even register as a gender thought. That was like, this is because fat bodies are treated a certain way in society. So it's very interesting how like things can be interlinked in that way. And there's just so much to unpack being in this very binary idea of what gender and sexuality can be. So we're all required to kind of do that work all the time as trans folks, as pansexual and bisexual folks who don't really fit within expectations of what heteronormative society says. Speaking of, in what ways do other people's binary ways of thinking impact you?
I'll start because I suspect I'm fairly privileged in the I'm fairly privileged in this conversation, in this area. And so for me, it's mostly about people who feel compelled to tell me what I am.
Mm-hmm.
And I know like my experience with that, I'm sure pales in comparison. But people do still. I'm 52 years old, and I am a formidable human being, and people still feel compelled to tell me what I am. And people will come and say, "Well, you're married to a woman, therefore you are a lesbian." And I'm sort of like, "Hi, I was raised by a lesbian. I know what that is." Also, do you even know me? So for me, that's like the kind of thing that I deal with. Mostly though, it's about trying really hard to be respectful and vigilant and open myself, to be to do my best not to fall into the binary trap in my social and professional interactions, and to support my trans and non-binary family and friends and colleagues. Like that for me is the big thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll go next. That really resonated with me, the fact that oftentimes I can preach out to the world, I can scream on top of the fucking mountaintops that I am this thing, and then people would be like, "But are you?" And it's just so frustrating. And my trajectory was like for a long while I was seen as a man, a gay man, definitely an effeminate man. I hate that word. It was called that so many times. It feels like a slur at this point. And then for a couple of years, I was a little androgynous, very confusing to people. And nowadays, I'm definitely seen as a woman, a trans woman if I'm clocked, which happens. In some spaces like drag spaces, a lot of times they just assume the trans identity when they see me. And then my history is just supposed to be accessible to them. Like, what's in my pants? I have to know. Was I born a man or a woman? They need to know. Am I a real woman? Have I had surgeries? All these things, they just assume that they can ask and just receive the answer like it's their business, like it's their information, like they're entitled to it. And they're not. They're absolutely not. And in terms of just being non-binary, being recognized as it, is very seldom that I am seen and regarded as non-binary outside of my chosen family. Like when I'm with my birth family, I'm either he, him, or she, heard. And for me, I'm like, the they's there first for a particular reason. Please use this. Like I was working at the University of Pennsylvania for almost like 2 years and consistently using they, she. Never once was I called they, them ever in my entire time frame there. No matter how many times I put it in emails or I talked about it on panels, it just did not happen. And it's frustrating. And I still live with it. But what I've learned is just to hang out with my chosen family, work with my chosen family, grow with my chosen family, and everyone else just like, bye.
I think for me, it has to do with the expectations of other people have to do with, like, even for people who are trying to understand me, I think like it goes without saying for a lot of folks who fall outside the binary, like in public, there's going to be just like a lot of difficulty, like with people getting pronouns, honorifics, all kinds of stuff correct, even if they like you note it and they make a good faith effort to change, like it's probably not gonna like happen overnight, but I think for me, like my biological family is pretty accepting of my non-binary identity, but I think that their expectations are still so gendered that they can't sort of understand the mix of things. And so like things that I used to be included in as a boy exclusively, like I should have said earlier, I noticed the binary first really probably through privilege, being assigned male at birth, and then seeing how like even my sisters were excluded from like more, I don't know, like masculine coded activities like in my own family, at school, etc. But coming back to how like the binary expectations, I think people are sort of like confused. Like when somebody becomes a vegetarian, they're like, but you still eat chicken, right? And so people are often saying to me, like, okay, you're non-binary, but, and then these things that are kind of questions or sort of probing, like about your identity, trying to figure things out that sort of show that their expectations can't really come out of that. And so if you're like, no, I don't like football or baseball or anything like that, one, to me, that's not even gendered in the first place, like why is it gendered? And then it'll be like, okay, so then you like, and then some, like whatever in their mind is sort of like the feminine opposite. And so there's no sort of like interstitial space between those two, or that doesn't recognize those two as, like being, like imbricated in like a real, whatever they think about gender identity, And so it has to do with like, even when people are making a good faith effort, if they're not part of my own like chosen queer family, then there's still like this sort of switching back and forth instead of finding that kind of middle ground.
Yes, very that. I feel like I still haven't finished unpacking all of the ways that my identity is formed by the society that I was raised in, and how often like I have to separate how I'm feeling about myself and my gender and my body as opposed to how other people are kind of informing me. Because I feel like there's this expectation of like transitioning from one binary option to another. And so when you start talking about like transition options, about hormones, about medical transition, whatever, people assume that's like, oh, you're just going to become a woman. Mm-hmm. And I feel there's also this pressure to be like, well, maybe I should try to become a woman. Maybe it'd be easier for people to understand if I was just a trans woman and I could just be like a more masculine leaning trans woman. But it's like, if like I recently shaved off my beard to see kind of to see how I feel about it, but a lot of it was also to see how others would react to me differently without a beard. Because when I was during the pandemic wearing a mask, I was she, her, and ma'amed a lot. And so I was like, maybe if I just didn't have a beard, people would gender me correctly. But like, I feel like no matter what I do, there's people who are constantly like looking for these biological markers to see what people's genders are. They're like paying attention to like bulges and Adam's apples and broad shoulders and all that kind of stuff. It's like, why are you trying to clock people? Why are you so concerned? But then there's also this kind of like, there's those people who are kind of like seeking it out and trying to make it into a thing. But there's also people who are just like so ingrained in this way of thinking that it's like hard to break through to them. Because when I first came out as non-binary, I was like, I'm pronoun indifferent. You can use any and all pronouns for me. And within like a week, I was like, okay, not he, him anymore. Like that one's done and canceled, because people kept defaulting to it. When I say, please use any and all pronouns, like Samantha's saying, I want you to use all pronouns interchangeably and use them all often. But it was literally 99.9% of people constantly using he, him, and only occasionally getting the gay, she. So it was like nobody's, even in the queer community, nobody was using they, them pronouns. So I basically was like, my pronouns are they, them. And I don't even accept binary pronouns, because I just, like, I'll use she when I'm in drag. I don't really mind she as much, but like in reality, like I am non-binary. I don't fit within these confines of binary gender. And it's, no matter what I do, I feel like people either completely ascribe me to masculinity or expect me to perform a certain type of femininity. Love that. But speaking of kind of like in community stuff, like I know that a lot of bisexual and pansexual folks have been talking for decades about how they kind of experience biphobia or panphobia from cishet society as well as from within the queer community. And I'm wondering if you've noticed a kind of positive change or an improvement over the past decade within at least queer spaces when it comes to biphobia and panphobia?
Well, pansexuality is definitely just gaining more traction and more like people are recognizing it as something that exists. And for a long time, it really wasn't. And I think there's, especially within the community, there's this like weirdness in debate about the bisexual versus pansexual, insofar that bisexual excludes trans folks in some capacity or excludes non-binary folks, which is not necessarily the case. It hasn't been the case. Bisexual, it obviously means the two, but in actuality, the word in full means two or more. And it's supposed to welcome complication and nuance and all those things. And yet there are folks who are just unaware of that, who make a lot of assumptions about bisexual folks. And likewise, a lot of people understand pansexuality to mean you're attracted to every and anybody, which is not the case. Pansexuality is obviously the umbrella term, and there's omnisexual, polysexual, so many other kinds of ways of being. Some of them are situated in having an emotional connection with folks. That's how I identify with. Other folks have like genital preferences and gender preferences, stuff like that. And it's just different ways of approaching it, but so many people minimize the conversation and then pit the two identities against each other, which is a very fun and like TV thing to do. So.
I know I keep bringing up the context of the 70s and the middle of the United States, and it's because so much of this, like, I was formed in this really sort of strange petri dish in that way. And because I think in the 70s in particular, being bisexual in the gay community, which I was tangential to, because again, I was very young, but my mom was, and her friends and all that. Like being bisexual was almost code for I'm gay, but it would destroy my personal and professional life if people knew that about me. So I'm going to at least be bisexual, so you don't think I'm completely outside. And I think that, and the way that code sort of got deployed, particularly by people who were not faithful in relationships, you kind of wound up with this weird space where being bisexual meant that you were greedy, sort of sexually ravenous, right? But also that there's some sort of math involved, sort of like, hi, I'm a 60-40 bisexual. Yeah, well, I'm a 58, 42 bisexual, so I feel like we've moved beyond that to a to a large degree, but at the same time, and why I'm so like increasingly welcoming of pansexual as an identity is because people in the community still want to tell me what I am. And they still want to tell me, and I, even as recently as a few years ago, being in a group, and being told, well, when you figure out what you are, and it's sort of like, I've figured it out. You're the one who's having a problem. So yeah. And I've heard it. Yeah, I've heard it recently.
Or they think like once you've gotten like into a serious relationship or gotten married, that now you've like settled into an identity. And it's like, wait, I thought does your relationship status impact your identity internally? Like, that's kind of weird.
That does seem odd. Yes.
That seems weird. It's weird that like being in a relationship with someone else would impact your internal sense of self.
Isn't that odd?
I think it makes sense.
Yeah.
I think for me, within the queer community, I identified as bisexual until pansexual, kind of came as a sort of a replacement for that, as some people felt like that it was exclusive. I've never met a bisexual that is like in any way like just cis or even binary, you know what I mean, in terms of attraction. And so I still strongly identify with that with bisexual too, even though it doesn't accurately describe. But I mean, I think sure some people, like would say, that you just haven't figured out who you are yet. Dan Savage for many years maybe still maintains that no one is bisexual. They're either like hiding one identity or, or they haven't figured it out themselves. That's rubbish, obviously. But overall, like people will say that, in a conversation, like our friends will kind of joke about it sometimes. But overall, like I felt even as people sometimes highlighted a bisexual identity as like somehow like inauthentic or not, like so for some as a sort of transitional thing for people who don't know what they are yet or like can't come out. Overall, like I was treated way better, have always been treated way better within the queer community than the straight community. And so even though I've had arguments, I felt bad, cried or whatever a few times, overall, like the queer community is way more accepting of my non-binary identities, especially sexuality,
Agreed.
I feel like everyone here is kind of an academic, literally, or at least has the experience and background for it. So it's kind of interesting to talk about labels in this setting, because I feel like one thing that's not talked enough about labels is how they're really a shorthand for communication's sake. And the reason why labels exist are so that you don't have to go into a 20-page dissertation to explain pansexuality. You can just say pansexual. And I feel like a lot of what's happening is this discourse around like, well, bisexual is transphobic and pansexual is more accepting and this new label exists and you have to use it. But that ignores how like academic settings and academic like terminology evolves kind of separate from how things are utilized and used in the real world. And the real world applications don't necessarily line up with the textbook definition of things. And when people are choosing their own labels, it's a very personal decision. And so I think a lot of this discourse is just kind of the new evolution of gatekeeping. So 10 years ago, it was, well, bisexuals are just confused. They haven't chosen yet. They have their foot halfway in the community and they're not wanting to commit, blah, 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 whatever. And now it's, oh, bisexuals and pansexuals are valid, but bisexuals are transphobic. And so I must virtue signal about the word pansexual. And if you continue to use bisexual when pansexual exists, you're objectively a horrible person. Like that's the way that these conversations now seem to evolve. And it's just like, you just took this gatekeeping that is now clearly dated and updated it to still gatekeep in the modern day. So it's like, you're not queer enough, you're not femme enough, you are not presenting in a way that makes you clearly non-binary, you conform too closely to the gender you were assigned at birth. There's all these different ways that we keep within the community that it's just like, can you just let people be and recognize that you don't understand the universal experience of every single person in the world, and that people having a different experience than you doesn't mean they're lying or that they're doing something wrong. It just means that they experience the world differently than you. Anyway, that's my rant.
It's the assumptions for me that mess me up. Like I'm consistently gooped at, like, I tell people I'm pansexual, bisexual, whatever words I use, especially when I tell folks I'm poly, it's just like automatically it goes to, oh, this person's a huge slut and I can have fun with them. And that's not completely inaccurate, but there's so much more to the conversation. And like, I can't count the amount of times like cis men have hit me up and I've had conversations about, okay, these are my identities, this is how I identify, this is what it is. And they're like, cool, yes, I get it, And then a month down the line, they're feeling jealousy about me with other partners. I'm like, hey, but didn't we just have a conversation about this? Didn't we just talk about this? Were you not paying attention to me? And I find that people hear words and it triggers their learned stuff about that, and they just automatically assign it to people, as opposed to saying like, hey, these are my assumptions about this word. Which ones? How do you navigate this? How do you interact with it? How should I treat you? You know? Yep.
Yeah, I feel that. I feel like not enough people ask like, and what does that mean to you when asking about identities? Because like, a lot of these words are very vague. Like queer is a very vague word. It just means not straight. Like it's not a super descriptive sexuality, but that's why some people like it. Because I don't even know if I could describe my sexuality in words. At this point, I just treat it as a case-by-case basis with every person that I meet, because I feel like trying to explain it and categorize it, like especially to someone who may be interested in me, feels like I may hurt their feelings by saying that I'm not attracted to whatever parts of them. And it's like, but I might be, like, I don't know. Like, it's not as cut and dry or simple as that.
Right.
You don't want to write off an entire group of people based on one trait. But people sometimes be like, oh, you're mostly attracted to masculine folks, so therefore I as a femme person shouldn't even try or shouldn't even like say anything. And it's like, this is why I use queer, because I don't want people to get hung up on what the label is and try to figure out like what that means. I can just treat it as like a case-by-case thing.
I find that people kind of like, if you say queer, they're like, oh, okay. So it's just so much easier.
Well, you know, my wife and I confuse people all the time because she also identifies as bisexual or pansexual. And so, and we're this monogamous, married, same-sex couple who both identify in that way. And so sometimes people, you can see it happen. You can see it. They meet us, they engage with us for a little bit, and then this thing happens in their brains where they're like, wait a minute, I think, wait, no. Are they no, wait. You know, so, I mean, that can be kind of fun to watch.
I also find that, like, I am often defined by the current relationships that I'm currently in. And so if I told folks, like, I'm dating two cis-identifying AMAD people right now, they would be like, oh, so you're just a straight trans woman. You're not really pansexual. Not really, because this is what you're doing. And I'm like, this one little moment does not define who I am.
Yeah.
Like, do you become asexual when you're single? Like what kind of
Wait, is that how that works? Because that doesn't.
Yeah, no, your identity and sexuality don't change based on who you're with. It's a part of your identity and who you are.
No, I think for me, the only thing that has changed is that I have a larger community in which I feel like I can be myself.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's the big change.
Yeah, that's real. Having, like, honestly, since I came out as non-binary, I've actually had like much more community, I think, or like at least a much deeper sense of community. I feel like there was a lot of more shallow sense of community, especially like in the bar scene. I feel like a lot of times, like especially gay male culture is centered around like going out to the gay bars, going to drag shows, doing all these things. And I feel like the queer community is a little bit more like small intimate house parties, like getting to know folks, like spending a little bit more time, like developing closer friendships. And so that I feel like, I mean, obviously there are gay men who do that. A lot of them decide not to partake in the nightlife scene, and they find their niche and their group of friends. But I feel like when I came out as non-binary and queer, like I was like instantly surrounded by this like queer trans community that like had been kind of acquaintances before, but now were the people who I went to talk to about the transphobia I was suddenly experiencing and had never like had to deal with before. And so like I guess it's kind of trauma bonding, but it is kind of wild, like how there is this like strong sense of community in Philadelphia, especially within the queer and trans community. It's a special place. But so I have one more question for you all, and then we'll open it up to just kind of last minute thoughts and musings. But over the past few years, there's been a lot of discussion about trans inclusive bathrooms, all gender restrooms, and the inclusion of transgender athletes in competitive sports. So I wanted to ask, do you feel that binary and non-binary trans people are equally considered in these conversations? And what do you wish more cis people understood about these conversations? Amy, you can choose not to answer this if you don't want to. but I'm just gonna.
Yeah, well, so a lot of the debate I'm hearing is centering around professional athletes and it not being fair if trans women compete in women's sports. I also find that the people who make those kinds of arguments in the neg often don't have the information necessary to even come to a conclusion. They make a whole lot of assumptions about what our bodies do, what HRT, hormone replacement therapy, does to our bodies, and then they make conclusions based on those assumptions. Like one thing that they oftentimes do not know is that someone who's assigned male at birth, if you have introduced HRT into your body for the duration of a full year, there are so much parts of our makeup that is incredibly similar to what a cis adult woman or female would look like. It's just so incredibly similar.
Mhm.
And so when it comes to sports where your body mass and how you're shaped and stuff doesn't necessarily factor in as much as other things like the hormones in your body, then there's like, okay, then there's like, it's fair. It's completely fair. But then there's other times like wrestling and bodybuilding and such where trans women would have an advantage because they've built up the body capacity and the mass that they have, and it would be seen as a disadvantage or an advantage to them. However, there's just so much debate around it and so much anger towards these trans women. But name me a single trans woman who has performed in an athletic feat with those circumstances at play. It just does not exist. There's one wrestler, bodybuilder, that Blair White loves to talk about, and saying how much that she like competes in women's and dominates and such. And if you see any of her videos, any of her working, she says over and over and over and over, I will not compete in women's sports. It would be unfair for me to compete in women's sports. It's all right there. It's all right in front of us. The facts are right there, and people are still gung-ho and angry about something that's never occurred.
Yeah.
And then there's like children's stuff, and that's like, it's kids.
Yeah.
Like,
I'm tired of people using children as a shield or as like a
Yeah.
virtue signaling thing, because the reality is that you cannot get trans affirming medical care as a child. No one is giving a child hormones. No one is giving a child surgeries. Like they're at the very most, they're put on hormone blockers, puberty blockers. No one is doing bottom surgery on a child. No one is giving hormones to a child who hasn't gone through puberty yet. Like those things are just not happening, but they become the center of the debate. And it's like this, it's not even a reality. Like no doctor would do this. They would lose their license. And even within wrestling and like bodybuilding and like MMA fighting, there's weight classes.
Yeah.
And like you said, after a year on HRT, like especially for trans women, your bone density goes down, your fat distribution changes, like a lot of your
the
body
muscle
changes.
stuff is different.
So yeah, if you are a bigger woman because you are trans, you may wind up in a higher weight class, but that doesn't mean you have any advantages necessarily.
I will say this, I find it very interesting, these people who suddenly seem so, obsessed with fairness and safety, who are making policies and complaining without actually like bringing in trans and non-binary people to, to advise them. It's sort of like,
I think another thing that strikes me about these debates is like, they're also linked to like these really old gender tests, like that affect negatively like cis female athletes, and like so many of the things we talked about today probably like they intersect with like patriarchy and misogyny. And so a lot of these debates are also about like, I think, continuing this oppression of like female athletes, of like women in general. Like it is just right now that the U.S. women's soccer team is going to have the same contract as men's. Like, that's obscene. You know,
Right.
2021.
Better than the men's team.
2021.
Exactly.
Look at everything
You know,
Williams has been through.
and so that's what strikes me about a lot of the stuff. You know, like not the bathroom thing as much, but the focus on like trans athletics and trans people in athletics. That it also is. It reminds me of how unequal it is, even within the binary, and how misogynist male-dominated sports culture is.
And racist. I mean, there's because when you look at the fact that like Michael Phelps has a like an evolutionary advantage, if you will, like his body produces less lactic acid or something. His body like literally produces less. It's something that allows him to power through things that other people would be exhausted and their muscle would be weak and like worn out. He can keep going because he has this biological advantage. No one says he can't compete. Yeah. No one says that it would be unfair. But Simone Biles is so good at gymnastics that she can't even do a move because it would be unfair to other people.
And also, like, pretty much cool if people use enhancers. You know, like I mean, there's rules about it, but then they can get caught. They don't like suffer really, and everybody kind of accepts it. You know what I mean? It's just super like messed up on so many levels.
And now there's actually 2 instances of Black cis women being told they can't compete because their testosterone levels are slightly elevated naturally, just because of the way their bodies are. And like people think of testosterone as a male hormone and estrogen as a female hormone, but every single human has different levels of estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone. And those levels are not necessarily determined by your gender. They are determined by your specific body. And so like, yes, there are normal ranges for male and female folks, but the biological sex is not binary either. It is bimodal. So there's people who fall outside of those normal ranges because everything is about ranges. It's not actually like you have these things, you are a man, you have these things, you are a woman. Like people are taught, like those are the most common combinations, but there's millions of people on this earth who don't fit into either category neatly scientifically based on their biological sex. And so if you start really kind of looking under a microscope at everybody's biology and start excluding people based on whatever advantages they may have, it becomes arbitrary because everyone has different advantages and disadvantages. And part of the fun of sports is seeing who's going to come out on top with certain types of circumstances. And you never know what's going to happen because something that may be seen as a disadvantage may wind up helping you in another case. So it's like, why not just let these athletes compete? Because like Sam said, even with trans athletes involved, they're not like dominating the sport. Like the first trans weightlifter, I think, didn't place. They didn't wind up on the podium. And there's been it's not a reality where trans people are just excellent at this, but also the only trans people who will ever make it to the Olympics are probably exceptional to even get considered for that because of all of the transphobia that exists in our society.
Yeah, so something that I found is that like trans issues sometimes like not even real trans issues are used to hide other issues. So like if we're talking about scholarships, for example, a lot of parents would be upset that a trans person would win over their cis daughter or whatever, because now her access is now stripped away because of whatever. When in actuality, it's like very weird that sports is the reason you go to college. Like why is that? Like it doesn't really make too much sense. Why are we putting all this effort also on just like the trans person when we have this bigger national issue?
Oh yes.
Circling around like access and shit. So like it feels like trans folks are used as a scapegoat very often, and we're the butt of the conversation, and all the things that actually should be talked about, that should be unpacked, goes unnoticed because we're all stuck in this trans conversation that isn't really a factor.
I feel like also like trans people are not like trusted to make our own decisions about our body, which I mean is not surprising in this country considering the current debates happening in Texas. But I mean, how often do people get tattoos, piercings, body modifications without the consent of anyone else? Does anyone go, well, you're really going to regret splitting your tongue? Yeah, people say that all the time. But if the person wants to do it, who are you to say you can't do it? And the reality is, like, a lot of trans affirming medical care is kind of put on this binary where you have to fully transition from one binary gender to another. And there's this pressure to do so where it's like, well, you have to get top surgery and bottom surgery, and you have to do hormones, and you have to do this. Otherwise, you're not serious enough about your transition to be taken. Like, what if you regret it? What if you change your mind? People change their minds all the time. You think a trans person hasn't agonized over this decision for a long time before even consulting a doctor? Like, the way we don't trust trans people to know what we need and what our own bodies want because we don't trust that trans people are real as a society. Like, it just shows how much like cis people don't even recognize trans identities as real and valid because they don't even trust us to affirm our genders through modifying our own bodies. Like, that's just basic bodily autonomy.
Yeah, it feels really, really weird and wrong that I have lied to my healthcare providers to gain access to things like hormones. It's very strange. It's very weird.
Yeah. You sometimes have to. Like, I know there are doctors who will not do top surgery on a non-binary person. They're just like, you're going to regret it. And it's like, who are you, cis woman, to tell this trans person how they're going to feel and if they're going to regret? Plus, they've done multiple studies, and out of like 4,000 people studied, there was one person who was actually cis and made like a rash decision or like got swept up in the moment and regretted it. But like, that's pretty low numbers. Like, that's 1 in 4,000. And part of that, a lot of the people who were dissatisfied with gender affirming surgeries are folks who felt that transitioning made their life harder because people are like now treating them differently and discriminating against them. And so now they regret putting this target on their back, or they felt pressured to transition further than they felt comfortable as a non-binary person because they were expected to fit within these binary ideas of gender. So out of all of these people say, there's a lot of people who regretted having surgeries, but only one of them was actually cis. The rest of it had to do with the way the society treats trans people and doesn't trust trans people to make decisions for their own body. And they were either pressured to do more than they were comfortable with, or they met severe backlash. And so part of the issue is that we need medical providers who are trans affirming and listen to and trust their patients to make decisions about their own bodies.
I think it's really awful that bigots will use the experiences of people who detransition as a way to like spread hate. It is the most awful thing because to transition so hard, and then was my experience at one point. I have hormones taken away from me, and that was just like awful. Like what it does to your body is awful, and then to be used in a way that you're like going to take your experiences to attack other people who are actually affirmed by the things that you tried to do and didn't really work out. It just makes you feel just like utter shit. Like it's like you can't do anything right. It's so icky.
Especially because I feel like a lot of people who detransition are not anti-trans or even leave the community. A lot of them just are like, I'm actually non-binary. I'm not a trans woman. I'm not a trans man. I'm non-binary. Or they're like, I'm actually cis, but they spend so much time with the trans community. How are they going to now like send hate to these people who are still living? You know, like I feel like a lot of people who detransition don't have these toxic ideas that they're being used as the poster child for.
But it sells.
Yeah,
outrage and fear tend to do that.
Imagine a world where, grown people get to make decisions about their own bodies.
Well, and children too. Like I think that like some of the things that get excluded, like children aren't even like humans, like according to the medical like discourse and things like that. So they can't make decisions without their parents, you know, like granting permission. And most parents, trans kids are not supportive. So
yeah.
I didn't even try.
Those numbers changing. Thankfully, we are seeing a lot more trans children.
Yes.
Who do have affirming parents, who do have access to hormone blockers, who do have access to the ability to socially transition and wear affirming clothing, and have their pronouns respected and their name respected in their own homes. Like that's always really encouraging to see. But yeah, every time they use children as a way to be like, well, they're doing surgery on children, or these children, who will think of them being assaulted in bathrooms and blah, blah, blah. It's like, never mind that there's no recorded cases of trans people attacking anyone in bathrooms, but there are multiple cases of trans people being attacked in bathrooms. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, I feel like bathrooms are also very binary set up, and it's hard to find places that you don't have to choose between men's bathroom and women's bathroom. And when you're someone who is often clocked as a man, who often dresses feminine, that sometimes is the choice between like feeling unsafe, like someone's going to like yell at you for being a sexual predator, get out of here, you're not supposed to be in here, versus facing physical violence.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of the conversation has been around like trans people gaming the system to get access to these bathrooms, but like we've been using them for years without issue. So yeah. Well, I guess that's the end of our conversation today. But I did want to ask, like, is there anything that you wish that cis heterosexual or cis gay folks who don't really understand binaries could know? If you could answer this question once and not have to answer it again, what advice or what knowledge would you impart? And we'll end on that note.
I mean, I think that I wish that they would know that people's identity like is more versatile than they realize, and that, you know, somebody who starts off identifying as heterosexual because of like heteronormative culture, and then transitions to like non-binary, and then transitions to like on a more binary trans identity, doesn't mean that any, you know, like one of the identities that they held as authentic was in any way inauthentic, and that people, like everybody, like changes. It's just like, why are we focusing on this one thing? And so I wish that people would just like accept, you know, like instead of being like, oh, you know, you're on the way to coming out as gay, or you're on the way, you know, accept like at whatever point, you know, that other people are at, that they're smart enough to understand their own identity is better than anyone else, at least.
And I'm also biracial, and have also experienced a life of people asking what I am, and my response to that has often been what my answer is, which is, if you're trying to figure out what I am so you can put me in a box and figure out how to treat me, you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I wish that people would stop treating transness and really any label as linear and monolithic. Everyone's experience is going to look drastically different from each other. So just stop assuming because your one friend is trans and this is their experience, that every trans person has that experience as well. It's simply not true.
Yeah, going off of that, I wish people would stop treating non-binary as a single gender. It's like, oh, it's the third gender.
Oh my God.
It's an umbrella term for every gender that isn't the two ones you already know. Like, it is a galaxy. It is an infinite possibility. Stop trying to act like every non-binary person is the same, or every non-binary person owes you androgyny, or every non-binary person has to act or look a certain way, or that non-binary people are just women light. So they're a fun one I've seen a lot. Yeah.
That's kind of accurate for me though.
Right. But it's not for everybody. That's the whole point.
No.
You know, it's not for everybody. And so we need to stop doing that. We need to stop treating like that people from marginalized groups are basically representative of their entire group instead of being seen as individuals.
Stop asking me questions without paying me.
Oh, right. Yeah. Pay for labor. Let's do this. All right. Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you for kicking off the semester with our first discussion series. This was a great conversation. And for folks who came in a little bit late, this recording will stay up at the same link on YouTube once YouTube is done processing the video. So you can come back and watch it at any time or go back and watch the beginning if you missed it. Thank you to our guests for being here, and we will see you all at our next event. So check out Pride Portal to see the calendar of events, and we'll see you next time.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.